Abolition, and Anti-Fascist Pride digital teach-ins. We are gathered today as we gather today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 13 territory, a treaty that was established between the Mississauga of the New Credit and the British Crown. We are surrounded by Treaty 13A, Treaty 20, also known as the Williams Treaty, and Treaty 19. Today, I speak with you from the city called Toronto, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe, including allied nations, to peaceably share and protect the resources around the Great Lakes. For those of us who are not Indigenous and have arrived as settlers on Indigenous territories in different ways, we acknowledge that some of our ancestors and elders were forcibly displaced people, brought here involuntarily by force, particularly those brought here as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people and that we all have responsibilities while working and living on these and all lands. Tonight's teaching, Abolition, Police, Prisons, and Carceral Injustice, is the first of a series of 5 teachings during the month of June with a focus on drag performances and resisting fascism, which will be next week on June the 8th, Creating and Building Abolitionist Futures on June 13th. On June 15th, we have Sex Work and Harm Reduction, Encampment Support, and Abolition Solidarity. And finally, we have Art and Poetry at the End of Times on June 21st. Please feel free to visit us at our website, which is noprideinpolicing.ca for all events, and also visit us on social media. You can find us on Twitter and on Instagram as well. I will be your moderator for this evening. My name is Idil Abdillahi, and let's go ahead and begin with our first panel member this evening. Rinaldo Wallcott is the Carl V. Granger Chair of Africana and American Studies and the Chair of the Department of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. He's the author of On Property, Policing Prisons, and the Call for Abolition by Biblioasis. Rinaldo, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you to No Policing for organizing this series of events and talks, and for bringing me into this conversation. You know, I've been wondering a lot about what I might say today that might be useful to a conversation that tries to take the history of pride seriously and also think about the very long stalemate of what I would call corporate pride that we find ourselves in. And so some of you might know that it's now become a kind of ritual for me at the beginning of June for the last few years now to tender my resignation as being gay or queer until July 1. And part of the reason why that ritual has become important for me is what I'm going to call corporate pride. Corporate pride with its big money sponsors who actually gives them very little money has turned into a project that is clearly, absolutely clearly not at all interested in the future of a potential sexual liberation, of a potential gendered liberation, of a potential liberation from white capitalist heterosexual patriarchy. So every June, I now ritualistically resign from being gay or queer. And it's actually only something like the No Policing Coalition that could actually get me to participate in something like this. I think my small act is really about saying what this year the Abolitionist Pride has titled these talks, "No More Shit." I'm tired of the shit. I'm tired of the exploitation of queerness, trans life, Black queer life, Black gay life, Black non-heterosexual life as a token inside of a niche market for capitalism. That's what corporate pride has produced for us. It's produced us and offered us up to capitalism as a niche market. And on the other side of it, the festivals, the parades are now entirely marketed as city events, entirely in service of the heterosexual gays. So even if queers seem to think that we're still doing this for ourselves, with our rainbows, and for some of the heterosexual leaning, homo normal leaning guys, their occasional drag, with tits exposed, ass exposed, hard chisel bodies on display, and so on. I would say that we have now reached an era where we're fooling ourselves, that we're performing for ourselves, that we have now become a kind of queer clowning for heterosexual gays. And this queer clowning has very little to do with a potential queer liberation. It has very little to do with the kinds of sexual and emotional and political intimacies that that should be the bonds of a potential queer community and queer communities that continually work towards some idea that we might call freedom or liberation. So for me, corporate prides are as much a problem as they are as the re-emergence, the more vocal and vulgar re-emergence of the quite vigorous trans hatred that we're seeing in the US, in the UK, in Canada, and elsewhere. And of course, we know that this trans hatred and these attacks on drag queens that are really about attacks on trans people, that are really about attacks on the inability to understand how gender works, what gender means, and why gender liberation is absolutely important. It's something that corporate prides in the moment of this month will appropriate and have appropriated as a way to legitimize themselves. But we have to be cautious about that, because corporate prides have been able to market themselves over and over again to governments and corporate entities as the buttress between our communities and their own increasingly corporate NGO interests. So I know that many of us have spent a lot of time trying very locally here. I'm going to speak from the space of Toronto, very locally trying to reform Toronto's Pride organization. And I would say that it's about time that maybe we give up on that struggle. I know many people are going to say, well, given the current attacks, particularly on trans people and queer people, that Pride this year is particularly important. And I get that sentiment. But again, I'm cautious about that sentiment, because if that sentiment finds itself becoming a part of a wider network of policing and surveillance, as the 1.5 million that has been allotted does, again, what we see is that Pride organizations become a buttress between community desires and government surveillance. And we all know that government surveillance has a deep and disturbing, and I'm sure Gary can speak to this in great historical detail, a deep and significant impact on our communities, impacts that people are still living out today. So all this brings me to, the final point that I really want to make. And the point that I really want to make is that in the realm of a set of significant and political upheavals, that what corporate prides don't offer us is any kind of political language, any kind of political strategy, any kind of political organization to not just fight back against fascism, policing, racist, and homophobic policing and surveillance. Pride organizations, corporate pride offer us none of that. And so we have to continue to work on inventing new visions for what queer community might be. We have to insist that queer community transforms itself over time and over decades, and that different kinds of political projects become important to queer communities over time. For me, a corporate pride that has no place for the radical politics that concerns itself with the liberation of Palestine is a corporate pride that is not worth having. And so for me, I can't participate in corporate pride. I can't support the manner in which it acts as a buttress between communities, governments, and corporations. And finally, my position here is one in which I absolutely believe that we should be abolishing corporate pride, that the time to continue to fight, to transform, to regain pride organizations is behind us. We should put corporate pride on the list of all of the things that we need to abolish in service of taking the risk to make a new, and dare I say, better society. I'll end there.
Thank you so much for that, Rinaldo. Very, very thought-provoking things that you've said here. We'll move on to our next speaker, who is AJ Withers, a longtime community organizer, and the Ruth Wynn Woodward Jr. Chair in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. They're the author of Fight to Win, Inside Poor People's Organizing, A Violent History of Benevolence, Interlocking Oppression in the Moral Economies of Social Working with Chris Chapman and Disability Politics and Theory. Welcome, AJ.
Thanks so much, Idil, and thanks No Pride in Policing for having me. It's a real honor to share the proverbial stage with folks, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I want to begin by telling folks that I'm a disabled, queer, trans, non-binary, white settler speaking from what's now called Vancouver, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Saanich people. And so much of what I'm talking about today really draws on longstanding justice practices of Indigenous people. Police, prisons, and carceral institutions are colonial impositions that are presently used as colonial tools to confine and suppress Indigenous peoples and cultures. So much of the solution to the current problem doesn't lie in inventing new relations or new systems, it lies in decolonization. So I've started watching a TV show called SWAT, which is a cop show, and I started watching it because I really wanted to understand what contemporary propaganda is like. If you take just one thing from my talk, let it be that not to watch this show. It's just truly terrible, but I've learned a few things from it. I've watched 2 and a little bit seasons. So one of the things is that there's a queer character who's part of the SWAT team, and a little bit into the show, she becomes part of a throuple, which includes herself and a man and a woman. And everyone but one person who's on the SWAT team really supports the throuple right away. And the other person comes around fairly quickly, and his concerns are really about her, and he's a good guy. And the throuple is insulated by race and class privilege, but it really notably pushes past these ideas around homonormativity and respectability that we often talk about when we talk about the police and LGBTQs, people's relationship with the police being one of access and respect if they are part of homonormative respectability. And I think it's really saying something about shifts and the cutting edgeness of this sort of new propaganda discourse. The second thing is it demonstrates the depth of the crisis that occurs both at the city level and in the personal lives of the characters when there's a 15% budget cut to the SWAT team. The characters that we're supposed to come to care about, one of them almost loses his house. And we really learn the necessity, both individually and for the security as a whole, of keeping the police budget intact. Third, we learned that all shootings are justified and necessary, aside from one tragic but entirely understandable accidental shooting, that's in air quotes, of young Black youth. And officers must, they say, rely on their training to shoot people, not on their judgment, because that's how people get killed. And then lastly, we learn that there are three kinds of people. There are sheep who do everything that they can to avoid the use of violence. There are wolves who prey on the sheep using violence, and there are sheepdogs who protect the sheep from the wolves. And this sheepdogs, wolves pushes also past standard narratives that I think a lot of us are used to around good versus bad people. And here there are good people, bad people, and better people who use bad tactics sometimes because they're heroically compelled to put themselves in the line of danger to protect good people from bad people. So this propaganda is really fascinating because it's actively speaking back to defund and abolitionist movements, but it's not speaking back to the actual movements and their ideas. It's creating a fiction about what we support, and it's perpetuating fear about what abolition is. SWAT has an anti-racist and queer positive veneer, but it is actively upholding white supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy. So the imagined abolition of SWAT, of Fox News, most news, actually, Toronto mayoral candidates, etc., is chaos. It's no checks on violence and harm. It's swinging open jail doors, and it's letting murderers onto the streets tomorrow. And so, of course, this sounds scary, but that's not what abolition is. And this propaganda that's being put forward by people is in order to help maintain state violence, that the violence that the state perpetuates. Pride Toronto and mainstream LGBTQ movement is a part of this group that is working to uphold that status quo. And it benefits those who already have power and privilege to maintain the status quo, and it benefits normative LGBTQ people to embrace liberal values and rights discourses and work for soft reforms to gain full inclusion into these violent relations. The real life responses to movements to defund and abolish the police that we're seeing that have been adopted are also carceral. So carceral means that they use prison, police, discipline, and confinement logics and practices. So these real life responses doesn't mean no police, it doesn't mean no prisons. It means in some instances, the first point of contact for people in crisis may involve a nurse, social worker, or community worker with the police. In other instances, it might involve a team of those folks without the police. So to the point of social workers, residential schools were genocide. Genocide is the taking of children forcibly from one group and taking of children and forcibly transferring them from one group to another. And right now there are more Indigenous kids in the custody of the settler state than at the height of the residential school system. Over half of all kids in the foster care are Indigenous as of 2021. Even though there is increased effort to place Indigenous kids with Indigenous families, social workers were actively part of the residential school system and are actively engaged in genocide today. So they also are actively disproportionately removing Black kids from their homes and the kids with disabled parents. So this group that's so rigidly policing Indigenous, Black, poor, and disabled communities can't be part of the solution to police violence. The solution to the abuses of the police isn't carceral care. That's also what's being put forward often is like mental health treatment. And here in Vancouver, they're often talking about forced treatment. The solution isn't forced mental health treatment. It's not forced drug treatment. It isn't violent. For a very long time, there's been a split in the perception of people between what they have done and who they are. So people supposedly in prison for what they've done and people supposedly in mental health institutions or long-term care for who they are, or perhaps for what they need. But people in prisons are disproportionately there because they're poor, they're BIPOC, it's because of who they are. And people who are in institutions are there because they often, especially in mental health institutions, because the police put them there, because they had an interaction that stemmed from panhandling, loitering, sleeping on transit or in the park, or being disruptive because of something they quote unquote did. So this division between who people are and what people did just doesn't hold. It's fundamentally about imprisoning people based on who they are. Mental health and drug courts are often used to secure compliance, including the taking of medication that people don't want, and that causes really negative side effects for folks. Carceral institutions are carceral first and foremost, whether or not they have curtains or bars on the window. And abolitionist struggle must involve abolishing all carceral sites, including forced treatment and long-term care. So that's why Disability Justice Network of Ontario has put forward a call for the abolition of long-term care sites for exactly this reason. So repeatedly, the solution that's used to address violence is police, but police are after the fact responders. When crime is perceived to rise, not necessarily rise, the answer is often police. Hire more cops, hire private security to patrol the parks. But the chances of the cops actually being present to prevent a crime are minute, and the cops escalate problems. They escalate crises over and over, and they kill people. So it's really important to actually work from the bottom up to work at addressing violence at the start and abandon simplistic narratives that there are good people and that there are bad people, or the slightly more complicated SWOT narrative of sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs, and understand that each of us is capable of causing harm, and that working to rectify that harm will be what keeps people from causing further harm, not putting them into like deeply traumatizing carceral sites. So abandoning this binary of good bad is a real fundamental principle in my view of transformative justice, and transformative justice is for me a prerequisite to abolition, and it's something that we can practice now. It doesn't mean that it's perfect or that any of us can enact basic justice principles without flaw, but it means that we can actually live justice now. If folks are interested, I wrote a zine about some of the ways that people do harm in doing transformative justice, called Transformative Justice and/as harm. But L. Jones says in Abolitionist Intimacies that abolitionism, and I would include transformative justice here, is also, quote, the shifting of knowledge hierarchies away from the idea that justice is the province of a few highly trained law experts and academics. Instead, we know the work of evolution lies in our communities every day, including in a refusal to abandon or dehumanize those living inside the walls, end quote. So abolition is about tearing down. It's about tearing down prisons and police stations, it's tearing down hierarchies, but it's also about building up. And it's about building material resources for communities. It's about building housing, about building collective care capacities, about building capacities to respond to crises, about building relationships in our communities and forms of non-carceral responses to crises and non-carceral social care. It's about finding ways to minimize harm and create social infrastructure that supports people going through their lives from start to finish. And I have, Rinaldo spoke briefly to the kind of increased attacks on trans folks, and I am feeling that a great deal as a trans person and have a lot of privilege as a white non-femme trans person. And the way that we protect these communities isn't with police, as some folks are calling for. It's with insulating folks, building community, and coming together. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, AJ. I'm struck by Live Justice now, so I'm gonna keep some of those questions for later. Thank you so much. We're gonna go to our next speaker, Gary, who's a member of No Pride in Policing Coalition. He's also the author of the Canadian War on Queers and the co-author of the 3rd edition of Regulation of Desire, coming out this fall. Gary, go ahead.
I always forget to unmute myself. Thanks, Idil, and thank you very much, Rinaldo and AJ. I'm going to move to something slightly different. We've been talking about what abolitionism is, and I'm going to talk about what fascism is and how, as abolitionists, we fight against it. So what is fascism? I think there's a way in which this is a popular narrative of just using fascist as a term to describe the most right-wing person that we hate around us. But I want to actually get us to think about fascism in a slightly different way, as a specific form of social organization of racist, nationalist, patriarchal, heterosexist, transphobic, and pro-capitalist organizing. That's really what we need to see fascism is. Early on in the emergence and rise of fascism, we actually see the use of what we can describe as stormtroopers to actually engage in violence. And here I would like to introduce something that might be useful from an abolitionist perspective, because I think what fascists actually engage in is pre-state carceral forms of violence and injustice that are intended to actually produce stronger forms of carceral state relations at a later point. So what we see with the objectives of fascism is that they're designed to try to crush the left, to crush the union movement, to attack queers, to attack Black and Indigenous people. And this is sort of what the objective of fascism is all about. It's why capitalists actually fund fascists. It's why they give them lots of support. Their objective is to impose major defeats on oppressed people and on workers. Now, their character varies in different social and historical contexts. For instance, in India, Hindu nationalism and Hindu fascism actually take the form of mobilizations against Muslim people, sometimes in incredibly violent ways. In Toronto, for a period of time, we actually had encounters with the Jewish Defense League, which was a Jewish fascist organization that fortunately no longer exists, that was mobilizing against Palestinians, but also very much against anti-Zionist Jews and other people opposing the Israeli apartheid regime. So historically, when we think about fascism, I just wanted to give some examples. In Italy, in the 1920s and 1930s, Mussolini and the emergence of fascism was a direct response to major working class uprisings in Italy that in the end were unsuccessful. And capitalists and their supporters funneled funds and helped to organize the fascists in Italy to challenge and to destroy unions and the left. And they were largely successful in doing that. They were very opposed to Slavic people, Jews, and were incredibly anti-Black and anti-African. We see that it continued with the Italian regime's campaigns in Ethiopia, which imposed racial segregation in that country. Then there's also the example of Germany, which a lot of people will point to. Out of the devastation of World War I, what emerges actually goes much further with defense of the so-called master race and the white Aryan race. They were financed by business from the beginning and eventually got incredible levels of support from big capital. They attacked the left, the unions, Jews, and used street violence. And this is really important to underline. They used street violence to crush these groups. The closer they got to actual state power, what we begin to see is the development of their own carceral state injustice. Their attacks on Jews became even more genocidal in character with the concentration camps and the murders of millions of people. They also attacked Roma people, homosexuals. We, queer people, were seen as non-reproducers of the white race, and therefore we were identified as race traitors. Gay men were placed into work camps, identified by wearing pink triangles, and lesbians were actually identified as being anti-socials, and were given black triangles. The Nazis were supported in all of these campaigns by major capitalists and Western governments. It's really important to point out that the Canadian state and the US state actively supported the Nazis until the Nazis actually engaged in invading other nation states. I just wanted to talk in a bit more detail about some of the attacks upon queer and trans people that the Nazis engaged in. In particular, they attacked the organizations that a queer activist and researcher by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld had put together, including the World League for Sexual Reform, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, and the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. In 1933, the Nazis attacked the Institute. They burned its books and research records, and they used stolen lists of gay men and trans people that have been collected by the Institute to actually round up people for the work camps. Trans people were seen as both race and gender traitors by the Nazis. But I wanted to also say something that is not often talked about or reflected upon. Early on, the Nazis actually had some support within white masculinist gay men's networks in Germany. It's important to be aware of the possibilities for some queer people to actually support fascism, especially among some white gay men. And we can see this already in terms of the white racist opposition to the movements to defend Black lives from some gay white men, which provide some resources for possible fascism. We see this in Northwest Europe, where there is major gay support for Islamic right-wingers and fascists. And we now see in the United States groups like Gays Against Groomers. And in both the United States and the UK, we see anti-trans LGBT groups with links with the right-wing and fascist groups. So I want to talk a little bit more about the so-called Canadian context for this. In Canada, there are very long histories of racist and fascist organizing that, of course, the government and liberals want us to forget about. But this includes the KKK, the Edmund Burke Society, the Western Guard, and later on the Sons of Odin. The Proud Boys actually emerge out of the Canadian military in the Canadian context, as many fascist groups have, and they have an incredibly anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racist character to them. But fascists have also been involved in defense of the oil industry, defense of extractive capitalism, incredible forms of opposition to Indigenous people, and oftentimes support for the police. Now, with the emergence of the COVID pandemic, the right wing and fascists realized that they had an amazing opportunity here, and they decided to take advantage of it. They merged with anti-vaxxer and anti-masking groups. This included current and former members of a group called Canada Unity, the People's Party, Yellow Vest Canada, the Maverick Party, Soldiers of Odin, which I mentioned, La Mute in Quebec, and more. Unfortunately, the lack of good responses from social movements, the left, and union organizing to the COVID pandemic, incredible space for fascism and the right wing to grow, because the left simply became the sort of left flank of the official public health establishment in the country. The Freedom Convoy actually won almost all of its demands, thereby hurting lots of people affected by COVID. So let's just move on a little bit from there. The Freedom Convoy was initially greeted and assisted by the police and allowed to occupy downtown Ottawa city areas. Through this successful mobilization, which was based on instilling fear and intimidation among residents who lived in those areas of Ottawa, the fascists actually managed to achieve a limited mass base for themselves across the Canadian state. This is what is now behind the mobilization against drag story hours and trans people. And I think it's really important for us to recognize those connections. If we don't, we actually don't understand where this resurgence of the right against queer and trans people is coming from. And there's also, of course, Christian fascists. There's groups like Liberty Coalition, and there's also Save Canada. There's a number of new sort of Christian fascist organizations that are developing that, of course, accuse us of being groomers, appropriating a term initially used to criticize the sexual harassment and abuse of young people. Now, there's been lots of responses across the Canadian state. There's been anti-racist coalitions. There's been groups like Anti-Racist Action, which existed in Toronto and a number of other cities that actually impeded and undermined the development of fascist organizations and racist organizations for a period of time. The objective of anti-fascist groups has actually been to stop fascists and to provide them with no public platform from which to organize their violence and hatred against us and other people. Now, some recent experiences that I'm just going to end on can show us a little bit about how we can resist fascism and the right wing. The Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, the turning point against it came at the Battle of Billings Bridge on February 13th, 2022. It was started by a dog walking group and the Punching Up Anarchist Collective, who noticed what was going on. And they managed to mobilize up to 1,000 people to actually block supplies and reinforcements for the continuing occupation of the downtown of the city. This successful community mobilization and plans to extend it in the following week is why the federal government enacted the Emergency Act, because it did not want people in Ottawa in their communities to actually respond to the fascists and right wing. Instead, it actually wanted to impose the Emergency Act, which of course is a very dangerous act for all Black social justice, Indigenous, climate justice, and other activists. There's also been defense of drag story time in a number of centers across the country, often with many more drag and trans defenders than fascists and right-wingers. I was at the mobilization at the Fort York Public Library to defend drag story time. We, and by this we, I'm referring to the 75 of us who were there. We defended the drag queens. We defended the parents and their children and prevented the use of pre-state carceral violence and injustice against them by the fascists. This was an important success, an important victory. The police who were there were not there to defend drag performers or trans people or queer people. Their major concern was actually in keeping the sidewalk unimpeded. And they also allowed the fascists to accost drag and trans defenders. The police are not on our side. And this is an important message that we need to send to all the corporate pride groups across the country. This Friday in Ottawa, there's again a mobilization against the right wing as it protests outside schools against trans young people. We need to contrast their hate and violence, the fascist hate and violence, with our solidarity and care. We are into meeting people's needs, not through pre-state or state carceral injustice, the types of forms of carcerality that AJ was referring to, but through community-based support. I'll end with this statement. Abolitionist social transformation is anti-fascism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. And now on to our final speaker for this evening, Percy Lezard. Percy Lezard is an assistant professor and chair of Indigenous Studies at Laurier University. They're a national and global leader as their work centers on Indigenous knowledges, two-spirit pedagogies, community Indigenous health, missing and murdered women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus communities in the context of gender-based violence specific to 2S LGBTQII plus communities. Percy, go ahead.
Holy. Why is squeezed in Chichin on me? Why lam kill chutin? Why lam pa Haudenosaunee Anishinaabe here on 1.313? Why lam no pride in policing? Why lam Rinaldo for setting the dinner table for us to be in conversation? I spoke in my language that not many people have access to as Indigenous folks, because personal introductions come before anything else, any other words. My Injilchan name is Intichin, which is the responsibility of the wolf. My Indianak name is Percy Lezard. And my relations are the Lezards in Sinpinkton, which is village between lakes. The Cougars from Arrow Lakes were a people, the oldest family of the largest family of the oldest family of the largest family come from, our origin story. And the Baptiste from Chopaka. As part of my scale of cultural practice and protocol, I wanted to begin my introduction with an acknowledgement of my positionality and responsibilities in an era across the academic industrial complex of race shifters and pretendians. It's important to identify who I am, who are my people, and who claim me. I am the adult child to Indian residential school survivors Valerie Lezard, Mose Baptiste, and day school survivor Pierre Cougar. My maternal grandparents are Indian residential school survivors, Tui Balwitzia, and their Indianak name is Elizabeth Lezard, and Ernest Lezard. My paternal grandparents were Indian residential school survivors, Tui Catherine Baptiste and Tui George Baptiste. We are all status First Nation members under the Indian Act of Penticton Indian Band number 597, and under our own nation's cultural membership code, I am claimed Atma Skeloch, the people of the land of Sinpinkton, which is the village between lakes. My people have lived on those territories known as the Okanagan Valley since the beginning of time. My traditional territories extend from Mica Creek, just north of modern-day Revelstoke and unceded British Columbia, and east of Kootenay Lake, south to the Washington state, where the nation state Canada-US invisible border, into Washington state, and up to Nicola Valley. Some of my responsibilities: I continue to live as an invited guest here in the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee territories, and upholding the dish with one spoon treaty that was created prior to settlers coming. And my nation-to-nation relations of the caretakers of these lands and territories. As Atmaskelo, meaning a person of the land, some of my responsibilities are that of a helper, firekeeper, in the 4-food chief system, which I come from a hereditary lineage of hereditary chiefs. My current homelands are occupied in the nation state of Canada, what is colonially known as British Columbia. My nation name, Sinpinkton, has never signed or ceded any treaties with the nation state of Canada or the representative King or Queen Charles III. And we currently live under occupation under the Indian Act, which in itself is an act of carcerality. And that has meant for me, and is the extension of the carceral nation state. Freedom Convoy also displaced my relatives, the Algonquins, right? Every act has displaced Indigenous people. That's even before I get to my queerness, right? Because since the birth of this country, it has introduced policies that have erased and disappeared stamya, which in my language means two-spirit person, STAMYA for the interpreters, or gender diverse people in my language is Minimchilks, MNIMCELX, which means a gender diverse person. And just to name the ways in which I'm complicit, and I am taking the spot of the Indian Scout. Indian Scouts through the histories and is dictated and shown through media is the one that hunts down Indigenous children who left residential schools and tracked them and brought them back. Went to reserves and removed children to go to day schools. I'm in that position today because I'm a board member of the agency that advocated in backdoor meetings to have that $1.5 million announcement happen, which originated on my homelands at the most recent conference that happened on my homelands. So I'm complicit that because I thought there's no Indigenous people on this national board, might as well throw my hat in the ring without actually knowing that these people have the capacity or desire or will to actually want to center Indigenous brilliance, Indigenous people, Indigenous protocol, without it being tokenism of smudge, territory, dance, and then move so the real queer celebrations can happen, which does not represent an Indigenous two-spirit trans existence. I know recently the RCMP celebrated their 150 years as an institution, but that institution was created to remove the Indian problem. Right. Before and to make way for settlers who wanted to get gold and land and resources, which is still felt by Indigenous communities today. And again, another active erasure of 2S LGBTQI folks, because Indigenous people wanted to take up and talk about the harms, the ongoing harms that have happened. 2S LGBTQI folks have been erased in the Red Paper Policy, which is a response to Jean Chrétien in 1969, writing the White Paper Policy, which wanted to disappear the Indian Act and dissolve any treaties or responsibilities to First Nations folks, which in that action pitted us against Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous, and Black Indigenous folks, right? Or the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which talked about ways in which various sectors could support a forest by us and how to be with the introduction of culturally safe practices for us. Or the 6,000 stories of the folks in the 126-year phenomenon of the Indian residential school of kill the Indian to save the child. Again, all these acts were not, they knew what they were doing because they erased the existence and from the landscape to us LGBTQI folks. Because as my parent and my older sibling, who's 13 months older than I am, was the last person in my family to go to residential school. A line was drawn down the middle of the room, and the fosters, the priests and the nuns were the ones that assigned gender and sex to folks, which again took away person sovereignty about this is who I am and this is how I am in the world and this is what it is in my language. and having the supports of the matriarchs and the people in the land to support that young person as if they were a two-spirit or trans person. So there are a lot of ways in which I'm complicit. I feel that until the corporate pride still take responsibility, and the one where I'm at most recently, Toronto Pride still takes responsibility for the ways in which it's harmed millions of dollars in the name of Kent Monkman and First Nations Reserve, because they've still yet to take responsibility for those dollars. And most recently announced 2 sponsorships of pride activities happening on reserves. Those numbers don't compare, because if the problematics of EDI, if you want to mobilize language like decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation, and you still have not taken responsibilities for the wrongdoings, the ways in which you've harmed Indigenous 2S LGBTQI folks, it's not going to change. So my 5 minutes, I just saw that. So yeah, I was able to participate in World Pride because I was on research leave, and by invitation, people from Darug country, or what we know as colonially as Sydney, had World Pride dumped on its homelands. And much like the experiences here in North America, the Indigenous folks and Black fellas there experienced pushing in the peripheries, tokenism, right? And I think I may have been able to come into what it means to be a two-spirit person when I went to my first parade here in Toronto and met folks at Two-Spirited People of the First Nations. But it wasn't because of Toronto Pride. It was because the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous folks said, we exist and we're going to march, and we're going to march first. And we want, because these are our lands with this parade and celebration occupies, and it's important that we have relationships and connections to others. So I'm not going to privilege the fact that some board and some executive director decided to have a march, but the fact that Indigenous people continue to be resurgent, continue to find ways to come out from under the conditions of anti-Indigenous racism, ongoing colonialism and disappearance and tokenism, and wanting to be in relationship, radical relationality, that I was able to come into who I am as Stamia and Minimchilks. And it's not because of these institutions, because of these institutions seek to want to silence, disappear, and continue to add another layer of colonialism and displace us, because we're not the Indians they had in mind. And they're putting us back in the cupboard. I know I had 2 minutes, but I want to be in conversation with my relatives here. So limlam.
Thank you so much for that, Percy. Thank you, AJ. Thank you, Rinaldo. Thank you, Gary. At this time, if folks have some questions that they would like to pose to the panelists, please feel free and drop those questions in the online chat space. In the meantime, maybe just while we wait for some questions, I was wondering if maybe we can talk a little bit about the connections between things like queer clowning, propaganda, fascism, and sort of the broader struggles around settler colonialism, both here and elsewhere. Like those are sort of some of the things that came to mind in terms of what some of those connections may be. So I maybe want to invite maybe Rinaldo first, if you want to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think first, thank you to my colleagues. It's good to be in community with you. I think Gary put something on the table that we should be really attentive to in the definition that Gary offered of fascism, pre-state carceral justice. And part of what I was hinting at in terms of this idea that pride organizations are a buttress between actual communities and something else is that pride organizations actually help to hide that pre-state carceral justice by entering into these kinds of agreements with the state around policing and surveillance. And in fact, when the state takes up its own fascist violence, those kinds of agreements very quickly disappear. In fact, even as those agreements come into place, queer people and queer communities are still experiencing violence. So there's some kind of blanket for the march, for the festival. But the violence of housing, the violence of healthcare, the violence of the education system, the violence of everyday life continues unabated, especially for the poor, for Indigenous people, for Black folk, and so on. So increasingly, my own political attention is turned to what these organizations that act in our name are actually providing cover for. And so that was in part the point that I was making. And so this idea that Gary offers us of pre-state carceral justice or violence in relationship to how these fascist groups take to the street. And then the kind of defense that Gary gave us examples of, it's not pride organizations organizing those kinds of defense, not at all. They rather have a cocktail party with the very people who are unleashing those forces through their political rhetoric and so on. And so we have to be really pointed in being clear that pride organizations have now become a part of the problem.
And they're race to innocence and benevolence by saying that we're not the South, meaning positioning the United States. No, there's still that same type of violence that's here. We're just colonization light, right? We're the appetizer of genocide and cis heteropatriarchy, when the full course meal is what's happening in the UK or what's happening in the United States. But yet benevolence by saying I'm a good person, that's not me, and wanting to distance oneself when actually they're replicating and engaging in colonial mimicry and wanting grassroots folks or folks who are in opposition to this ongoing violence to be in collusion and collude, right? Because at least we're not them. But no, any type of violence is violence, and these systems are not meant to work. And if anything, the 154 years of this nation state has proven, with the disappearance and the erasure and displacement of Indigenous and Black folks, then what? Well, and we haven't even gotten to the intersectional analysis of queerness, right? So it's not going to change. It doesn't want to. It continues to benefit, not me.
Thank you for that. AJ, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I think that, I just keep coming back to the person that's leading the charge on calling for police for the exclusion zones around drag spaces and increased policing is the same person that put forward a motion to defund the police by 10% at City Council a few years ago. Kristen Wong-Tam, who's been one of the key LGBTQ leaders and politicians in Toronto for decades now. And it's I think a bit confusing to people how those two things go together, because they defunding the police and calling for more police don't fit together, except for putting forward a 10% motion that won't pass is only political opportunism and about optics. And I think that fits very much with that level of respectable queerness and pride that's happening right now, where there's an element of performative, I can't think of the word, but like people will speak to the issues that are being raised. They'll pretend that they have a contract with Kent Monkman. They'll like put forward these really performative moves towards engaging with issues around colonialism and anti-Black racism and policing and the harms that the communities that are really at the bottom are facing. And it's in the service of perpetuating their kind of pursuit of further privilege and normalization. And I think that it's really harmful and important for us to recognize when that's happening and call it out when it's happening.
Thank you for that. Gary, would you like to add anything onto this question?
I'm going to say three quick things. And they all relate to things that actually have to do with the No Pride in Policing Coalition, but also Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction, Surge Toronto, Queer Ontario, all of the groups that have come together to try to organize abolitionist and anti-fascist pride this year. The first thing is the TD Bank, the Toronto Dominion Bank, which is the major sponsor of Pride Toronto. In fact, in a certain sense, it's not simply just corporate pride, it's TD Bank Pride that occurs in Toronto. I asked a question at their last, I think it was I don't actually know which type of meeting was, but I asked a question of why it was that Pride Toronto supported the TD Bank and gets lots of money from them because of, and I used the example of the TD Bank actually providing funding for Coastal GasLink and the attacks on the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And I was told in response by a co-chair of Pride Toronto that many of the band councils actually support Coastal GasLink. They represent 2 to 3% of the land area of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And of course, it's the hereditary leadership that legally has the right to be able to make these decisions. So just wanted to mention that, so that like we need to actually break and rupture all of these relationships with these institutions like the Toronto Dominion Bank, the RBC, and so on. The second thing I wanted to mention was the Safe Third Country Agreement. You'll probably remember a while ago, Biden came to Canada and a whole bunch of people from AGAL, the LGBT Purge Fund, the Dignity Initiative, and unfortunately Rainbow Railroad were invited to the dinner with Joe Biden. Now, they knew that the Safe Third Country Agreement was being signed. It made it much more difficult for people to get across the border. So what it now means is that given what's happening in Uganda with the passage of very repressive legislation, it's much easier for asylum seekers from Uganda to get to the United States than to get to Canada. They will be barred from actually crossing the border into the Canadian state because of that agreement, which of course, these people going to this dinner didn't raise any protests around. And finally, I'll just, Percy, you mentioned the word intersectional. I just wanted to talk about how there's been an incredible sort of misuse of that term. So that if you actually look at EGAL, other mainstream LGBT plus groups across the Canadian state, intersectionality simply means inclusion and diversity. It's the same thing that it means for the Liberal government, right? It doesn't actually mean what Black feminists were trying to get at when they articulated and utilized that term. So I just mentioned those as three examples. I think that on June 25th, the Abolitionists and Anti-Fascist Pride March, if we can, we'll go to a TD Bank and actually protest against it. We will call for the immediate repeal of the Safe Third Country Agreement, and we will actually try and put in practice what intersectionality and a more mediational approach between all of our struggles is all about. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Gary. We have a couple of questions here from the audience, so I'll go ahead and read the first question. and ask panelists to have a look in the chat as well. So the question for the panelists is, I'd like to hear the panelists' perspective on conversational tactics to mobilize, quote, well-meaning, unquote, allies slash fellow LGBTQIA plus folks who feel enthusiastic about Pride, but are not seeing the sometimes defeating the corporate and Pride structure that are impeding the necessary progress. So maybe I'll ask Percy if you would like to start first, and then maybe any other panelists can pop on.
Well, with TRC deniers, residential schools deniers, one of the tactics are one of the ways in which I pose to settlers, racialized folks who come to these lands not by their choice, and they think, oh my God, this is such a wonderful place. And then when they go through a course with me or my partner, the wonderful folks in my program that really shares what this nation state is about, they're in disbelief. And then they want to know what to do. They move through the shock and awe, and they want to go, how can I mobilize? Well, the 6,000 people shared their stories, right? And if 150,000, whatever the number is, of residential school survivors that were documented that went through, mainstream says that there's 1 in 10, but with Indigenous people, there's empirical evidence that it's 1 in 5. So 20% of those children were 2S LGBTQI. But yet through the TRC, 10,000 pages of information about that horrific era, there's half a page, right? So I ask folks just to take your shock and awe and talk with other folks with shared lived identities. So Indigenous folks don't have to hold space for you. So I would ask that folks, don't call yourself an ally, call yourself an accomplice. And there's work done by Indigenous folks who want accomplices, not allies, and to be in conversation with other folks and do some heavy lifting, and show up and be barricades, human barricades, to protect drag shows, to protect families, to protect littles, and to go outside corporations, to be in conversation, interject. So I don't have to, or so the bodies that have been doing this work for a long time are able to focus their energies elsewhere. So that's one of the things that I would do. First, drop ally. I know that there's comfort in that, but ally just says, ally is just like a flag, much like that one back there, that says, hey, I'm a good person. Well, I'm not really looking for good people. I'm actually looking for people who are willing to do some work. Like ally is a good thing to some people, but accomplice is something that matches the actions and behavior to Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, and towards something else, because what's happening is not working. Well, for Black folks, Indigenous folks, and young folks, disabled folks, trans folks, right? So yeah.
I am just to sort of build on what you were saying, Percy. I think anyone that's asking me to explain to them why it's problematic to expect me to perform for straight people or clown in like i.e. be complicit in capitalist pride isn't an ally or isn't an accomplice. I think that's sort of a starting point, is like not requiring that conversation to come from me. And for other LGBTQ folks, I think that I don't really have an answer to that question, aside from my first reaction is that the canceling of Pride in a bunch of places in Florida, because they can't guarantee that people will be safe. And that to me is just like such a sign of where corporate pride is, that like Pride began as a protest. There was no guarantee that people would be safe, and that people will just cancel it because they might not feel safe. Is just outrageous that instead of coming together and fighting back as a community, they're just told to like stay home, is exactly what corporate pride is. It's about furthering the interests of corporations, of tourism, of a largely white middle class LGBTQ elite, and not what Pride comes from, and not resistance, and not actually like winning anything that the many like deeply oppressed LGBTQ folks need to win.
Yeah, I'll just pick up from something that AJ said, which is this question of a corporate pride elite. And we know what this is in part beginning an answer to Jared Matron's question as well. We know what those elites are meant to do. Those elites in niche capitalism are meant to manage the unruly masses. They're meant to be, to go back to the point I was making, they're meant to be the buttress between all of the rest of us who remain disrespectful, engaged in sexual practices that are not really seen as respectful, and so on. So when organizations like Idil and Rainbow or the Underground participate in the dinner and the secret of the Roxham Road border crossing agreement, they're complicit. They're complicit because they're now the representatives that are supposed to manage the rest of us. Now, we all know Idil has been a problem for a really long time, but even the Rainbow Underground its very founding, its initial founding was deeply problematic when we look at where its initial founding is. And secondly, I know it's really, Pride Toronto particularly has gone through a number of EDs, but it's really, and I know sometimes people think, oh, well, it's like you're attacking an individual, but all of these organizations have had the same executive director over and over again, which means that the organization becomes synonymous with their own material success in the world. So these kinds of practices tell us something about what we're up against. We're up against a model that has been well tried and well tested and has sustained itself quite significantly since the upheavals of the 60s, which is to produce a middle strata among oppressed communities that will keep the largely dispossessed of those communities in place. They will be the go-betweens, they will speak on our behalf, they will be represented at the high tables of power, and so on. But their job is to keep us in place and to keep our desires tamped down. This is what the corporate prides do. So the kind of question now, can we rescue it? No, because to try to rescue it is to suggest that it can return to the very thing that it already hijacked. It hijacked a grassroots movement and transformed it into this edifice. And so the only options that we have are to go to war with it. And the way in which we go to war with it is with what No Pride in Policing has been doing for the last few years, an abolitionist and anti-fascist pride, which is to say that we build an opposition large enough that actually becomes more and more meaningless and more ensconced in the ridiculous heterosexual gaze that it now so much clamors for. We have to find a way to convince our siblings or kin that that's not where they need to head. And that means that we continue to engage in forms of political mobilization, forms of conscientization, forms of education, forms of dialogue. And when people hear people like myself say what I'm saying, they think that we're coming out against partying. No, we're not coming out against partying. All queers know that the dance floor is an intimate and important space of political making and community. We all know that. Even queers who don't dance know that. So this is not against partying. This is about a particular kind of functioning of producing queer people as niche markets for capital, and that we should be happy with representation on the TD flyer once a year, right? So that they can take our measly coins and overdraft and other kinds of things. And so we want to work to create other modes and other visions of what our lives can be. And if we have to return to anything, we have to return to the radical politics of sexual liberation, a sexual liberation that allows us to be all kinds of ways of being in the world.
It's okay for me to say a few things?
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of in some ways really inspired by and sort of bouncing off what everyone has just said. I think that part of what we have to recognize is that what Pride Toronto and many other Pride groups have done is actually try to get us to forget our histories, right? So they get us to forget the history of what the Stonewall riots actually were. They get us to forget where celebrating Pride in Toronto as in relationship to the Stonewall Rebellion comes from in 1981. It comes out of our mass resistance to the police repression in the Bath raids. It comes out of queer and lesbian organizing against the right wing, which was on the rise then. The group that initiated Pride, the Pride March in Toronto and Festival at Grange Park in 1981, which we will return to this year on June 25th at 1 p.m. at Grange Park. That was a group that was called Gay Liberation Against the Right Everywhere, GLARE. Borrowing a name from Dykes Against Racism Everywhere in Brooklyn, in New York City. We need to remember that. We need to remember that the slogans that people chanted at that Pride in 1981 were, using Chris Birchall's expression, no more shit, against the police and against the right wing. It was also about fuck you 52, when we stopped at 52 Division and the police were really pissed off with us. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence actually did an exorcism of 52 Division. We chanted fuck you 52 for like 5 or 10 minutes. These are important things for us to remember, but what they have done with the sort of corporatization of Pride, and by the way, the Pride Committee, despite what Pride Toronto says, was not incorporated in 1981. Was not incorporated until much later. It did not accept any corporate sponsors until I believe it's 1987, when you actually begin to see the transformation of what Pride Toronto is all about. So I think that what people really need to have conversations about is remembering our histories, remembering our resistance. I think if people actually see that and hear that, they will actually begin to challenge a lot of what's going on with the sort of mainstream versions of Pride Toronto. Because they don't, I mean, I'll just give you one other example. They told us at the meetings of Pride Toronto, and I'm still a member of Pride Toronto, they haven't got rid of me yet, despite me sort of creating a ruckus every once in a while, they told me that they were combining protest and celebration this year. I've looked everywhere and I can't see where the protest is, right? I mean, in some ways it sort of disappeared. I mean, all they really wanted to do was to try and leverage the federal state to get more funding to cover police expenses, private security, and some of their insurance costs, which they, in cooperation with other Pride committees, have actually done. So I think that what we really need to do is to have, like, people who've been around for a while actually talk about our histories, right? Because I think one of the problems we also face is that the cross-generational sharing of our historical experiences is really fallen apart, right? So there are, I'm sure, lots of young queer and trans people who have no idea what actually happened in 1981, who have no idea what actually took place at the Stonewall riots in 1969, who don't remember that the Gay Liberation Front, which had lots of problems, was actually named after the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, fighting against US imperialism and war at that point in time, and that the Gay Liberation Front was in alliance with the Black Panther Party at that point in time, even though the Black Panther Party wasn't always in alliance with the Gay Liberation Front. So there's just so much about our histories that has been forgotten. And it's not just that sort of, it's passed out of our memories. There's people who actively want us to forget about where we came from. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Gary. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Percy or AJ, just in response, any final words from any of the panelists maybe? We have about 10 more minutes. No final words? Okay. So just really quickly, I think a few takeaways for me from the panel this evening. Thank you very much, AJ. Thank you, Rinaldo. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Percy. I think that a couple of things that I'm left sort of thinking about as the panel ends this evening are sort of the cautions that have been offered around understanding our histories and really being able to know and engage across generations, really thinking about this idea of the niche market that's been created within capitalism through queer and trans struggles, and having a real mindfulness of what that is. Really thinking a lot about the importance of mass resistance, the importance of understanding the meaning and the history of things such as No More Shit, as Gary talked about, as well as the legacies behind things such as Fuck You 52 and so forth. And ultimately, I think to not be distracted by, for example, what Gary talked about again, which is how we are being told that Pride is a protest this year as a theme. And so those were some of the key things that I had taken from the panel today. So on that, I invite folks again to please visit our website. Again, that's www.noprideandpolicing.ca. Please join the rest of our teach-ins that are happening for the rest of the month, along with our final event on June the 25th. Thank you to our two ASL interpreters this evening, Christy, and thank you to Kay as well. Thank you to Rajan, and thank you to Jen as well. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you at our next teach-in. Thank you.